When I was in seminary, I'm like a neat freak, so guys would go into my room and flip over my cordless phone because they knew when I got home, I would notice that someone had flipped it over.
Now you said cordless phone. You didn't say. Is it a cell phone or?
No, it's not a cell phone. This is like pre-cell phone days. Yes.
Yeah.
This is like 2004, man. This is.
Oh man.
And that was enough. You'd catch that.
Oh yeah. That? I mean, I couldn't study until like everything was like crisp and in place and perpendicular and horizontal lines and yeah. But now I have kids, so that's over.
Our goal on this podcast is to know Jesus better and by the power of His Spirit do better so together we can be a little better. Well, welcome to A Little Better. We are on week 9. Week 9 of 10 in our summer series, Storyteller. So, Jason, you are the penultimate, for those who are learning vocabulary.
Wow. Look at that.
Speaker on our tour this summer. So we got one more week after this, but thanks for bringing us the message. Thanks, Josh, for joining us. If you can't see, we got Josh Horn in the house. I am thrilled. Josh used to be on staff here, and he left for greener pastures to serve as director, your title?
Yeah, I'm the director of 441
Director of 441 Ministries. Right. Those who are watching, he's representing with the T-shirt today. But so glad to have Josh in the house. But Jason, why don't you help folks out? Why don't you recap your sermon in 60?
Yeah, so we're in the middle of a 10-week series called Storyteller, going over the parables. I jumped into Luke chapter 16, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and kind of looked at this contrast between the two. Jesus dives into all kinds of things, from talking about, the rich man being in Hades or hell. We'll talk about that later. And the poor beggar being in heaven or Abraham's side. And the main point of the message, though, isn't to talk about the afterlife, but to talk about how the rich man treats the poor and how we respond to the poor. And so my main kind of point was that love of money over love of people leads to hell, and urging us that if we want to love people well, if we love Christ, understand what He's done for us, then we need to live a life loving people more than money. One of the best ways to do that is doing what the rich man didn't, but to invite people into our home, invite them into our life.
All right, for those keeping score at home, that was 68 seconds.
Oh, but, that was pretty
close. Pretty close. You're there. Usually I ask the question, maybe I haven't asked it in a while, but what did you leave on the table? I'm going to table that question.
Okay.
A little dad joke there. Because I want to make sure that we get to Josh, who I mentioned. So glad to have you here, because the focus of this text really does highlight, especially the Pharisees. I mean, the Pharisees are just gutted in this text because they are the rich, the influential, the powerful in the society, and Jesus goes right after them. Right. So Jesus is unhappy with the way they are doing it. So how should they do it? How should we do it? How should we be loving the poor? I mean, you gave an example of just someone knocking on the door. I mean, I drive through the city. I live in the city, many street corners, there's people asking for help, whatever. Many encounters. What wisdom?
Yeah, maybe I can try to just ask the question that I said, like, who is God nudging you to invite into your home? But I started with a question: if a homeless person knocked on your door, like, what would you do? So,
right.
Is it responsible to invite a homeless person into our home? Is that wise? Is that good? Is that bad? So how do we even respond in situations like that? So,
yeah, it's a great question, and that's a lot of what we do at 441 Ministries and what we try to help churches think more deeply about, and kind of the mercy ministries that they operate and the work they do. And really the main thing I like to communicate to people and try to help people understand is to approach with humility, like recognizing that when we use the word poverty, we're directly referring to physical poverty, a lack of things, but poverty is so much deeper and wider than that. And when we get to a place where we really admit, that I have poverty. I might have physical things. I might have money. I might have resources. I might have a nice home. But I lack in other places. I might not have the relationships that other people have. I might not have a real right understanding of myself, whether that's pride or shame, right? So there's so many dimensions to poverty that are bigger than just physical things. And the sooner I get to a place where I can say, I am poor, even as I look at you and you're poor, but together we can find the bread of life, right? Like that is the narrative that Jesus is inviting to, the reconciliation of all things. And so when I recognize I'm poor, I can approach any of those situations. Someone on a street corner, someone that approaches us, comes to my house and asks for something, a cousin or a friend that's hits a dire moment and I'm not sure, will my money really help? Will I really be helping or hurting? Will I be enabling? Those kinds of questions, when they come from a posture of humility that says, I'm poor first, and let's figure out the best path forward together. That really is the heart of it.
What I love, Josh, you've been, preaching that, living that, for a few years, but I love kind of that holistic understanding of poverty, that multidimensional understanding of poverty, and the fact that we are all poor. And, we might be broken in different dimensions, right, but we're all broken. We're all separated. We all need a savior. We all need rescuing and restoration.
Yeah.
So,
and I don't want that to take away from the sense that God does have kind of special categories for the materially poor, like in this passage or in Matthew 25, Matthew 25. Other places where, there's a special category for the materially poor, but there's also a sense in which, he is close to the poor in spirit. Like when we get to a place where we can empathize with and connect with, that's where God's most present.
Yeah, so a lot of it, there's a heart posture thing. Like I need to recognize that I'm poor before God, just like everyone else. We're all beggars. We're all like Lazarus, in the story. We all need God's grace and help. So I think, there's a call to have a heart posture. But like, how do we? Maybe we do have more material wealth. Yeah. Like, what is a responsible, like, loving people over money look like? Does that mean like we should sell our house in the suburbs and move to the city? I mean, you did that.
Maybe.
So is that like something? I mean, last week Callum talked about the rich man go sell everything you have and give it to the poor. So, are we supposed to just get rid of most of our things? Is there ways like we can help people out materially that is actually helpful and not hurt? And it's like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, what I don't want to do is set up being rich as the primary problem, right? That's not the thing we're trying to avoid. It's what do we do with that? I even think of when Jesus called Matthew. Matthew was clearly wealthy, and then they had a dinner party at Matthew's house, and Jesus, in the midst of wealthy people, still called out the religious leaders, and it wasn't about the poverty, and it wasn't about the wealth. It was about their posture with what they were doing. And so being wealthy, being rich isn't the problem. It's that heart posture and then lived out practically. And I can talk about some of that. Did you have a question?
Yeah, no, go ahead. I want to hear.
Yeah, so, the first thing I would encourage people to kind of think through is what are they going to accomplish as they engage with someone who's materially poor? Like if you're in kind of the heat of the moment at an intersection and you're approached, that's a messy situation. You're processing a lot and trying to think, is my money going to help in this moment? And it might not. I think there's one way, pray is the first thing I'd encourage you, pray. Now, there's a place for hospitality. In this moment, as I interact with this person, is the loving thing to give them a few dollars? Maybe. But if that's something that you interact with a lot, maybe have something in your car. I often keep granola bars, a pair of socks in the winter, things like that, so that I can see someone, meet a quick need, offer to pray for them. So I know I'm not going to have the time to build a deep, meaningful relationship with them in that moment. Right. But if you do have a context where you can spend a lot of time with someone, the empathy piece, can I get to know their story? Can I hear where they are? Can I get to know them enough where I can find genuine ways to help, not just cash handouts, which often aren't the most helpful thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting, you contrasted like, is being rich what leads you to hell, or is that what God is condemning? And it's interesting, even in this passage, Lazarus goes to Abraham's side. Abraham was like extremely wealthy, and he was, this place of paradise. So everyone's going to be with Abraham's side. And Sheol before they end up in with Christ in the new heavens and the new earth. So he's clearly not condemning wealth in that story, but how we're handling our wealth.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned poor in spirit. And I think that's, because it's always that contrast, because when Matthew's gospel, we have the Sermon on the Mount, it's blessed are the poor in spirit. Right. But Luke says, blessed are the poor. And you feel that contrast a little bit. And it's both and, right? It's like we never want to say it's only a material problem, but never do we want to say it's only a spiritual problem, which kind of rationalizes away any need to engage with the material side of it. I mean, Luke has a passion for the materially poor, the disadvantaged, the foreigner, the woman, but it is a heart, issue. And go ahead.
Can I ask? So you lead 441. I think your mission is to love people and love people like with our money and other things. So how can other people partner with 441 to love people?
Yeah. One of the things that we often struggle with like a neighborhood-based ministry like this is people want kind of those one-off serving opportunities. So one of the first things I often encourage people to do is kind of check their heart and figure out the motivation here. Am I going to serve the poor so I feel better about myself, so I'm more grateful, those kinds of things? Those are possible results of that interaction, but they're not the purpose of that, right? It really is to be a reconciling agent, to bring the hope of the gospel, to invest well. We have serving opportunities at 441, but oftentimes what I'm hoping people will do is kind of go from come and get to know the ministry to how can I be a regular presence, right? Can I be around people week in and week out so that relationship gets built, not just the one-off serving, which makes me feel good for a day, but doesn't always lead to lasting change. It leads to an immediate problem solved, but not transformation in people's lives. The nice thing is we operate a cafe, so the smallest step is to buy a latte at New City Cafe, which provides jobs and helps support the ministry and really be present in the space, get to see what's going on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are there ways like people can give financially to you? I mean, like, would that be a help?
I try not to jump there on the first one, but you are always welcome to give. You can go to 441ministries.org, find the give page there. There's lots of, it's hard to run this kind of ministry because you want to ask people in the community in which we're serving to contribute to their own good, but by nature, it's an impoverished community. So those external resources from partner churches and people who love Jesus and love the ministry are so critical to what we do. Absolutely.
Yeah, where your money is, there your heart's going to be. So if you're trying to move your away from love of money, I think giving to something like 441 would be a great thing to do. So.
Yeah, and 441 is definitely one of our strategic partners at Northridge. We've loved the relationship. Josh, you used to be director of outreach. Was that your title?
Yep.
Because I know that's Michelle's current title.
That's right.
So you used to be director of outreach, and was it you that initiated the relationship with 441, or was that before your time?
Yeah, I think, that was when we kind of started building, at the time, Advent Conspiracy, and then into Beyond, looking for those partners that were really looking for impact, not just activity. So not just handouts, but how do we make a difference? And 441 was one of those ministries that kind of floated to the top, where they were about the long-term impact in the community. So yeah, I played a role in partnering. And Northridge, over the years, I mean, one of the major contributors to the launch of New City Cafe, Northridge funds and volunteers were critical to seeing that cafe launched. And Northridge volunteers have been key in Kids Club that we run and a number of other activities over the years.
Yeah, I would say we probably each need to do more, but the very easy ask is going to New City Cafe for incredible coffee. I love going there and just spending hours
Your
there.
community group?
What's that?
Go with your group?
Go with your community group. Yeah, absolutely a great idea. I mean, they have real cheap, bottomless cups of coffee.
That's right.
The food prices are reasonable. I will say, the food gets served kind of slow. Is that deliberate just to encourage relationships in community?
It's when Josh is in the
But don't be
kitchen.
in a hurry, because it's just a wonderful place to be.
It's the nature of a very tiny kitchen, and it's hard to control the waves of people coming in. The grill top is only like a couple feet long, and it's hard to fit
It's
all
good.
those eggs.
I've had food there too. So
Yeah, don't be in a hurry, which is always good
It is
advice.
good.
It's better to
Let's
live
just say it was intentional.
not in a
Yeah,
hurry.
it creates
It's intentional.
community.
It's done me a world of good. So, well, let's move on to. There's so much I could say. Sure. I just really want to talk more about this topic. So I will say this. Before we move on, can you just give us, because I'll throw it in the podcast additional resources. Is there some place you would direct people in terms of things you say, you know what, I want to live a life in right relationship with the poor, living in a godly way. Are there things that have been helpful for you?
Yeah, I mean, I always point people to the Chalmers Center. The Chalmers Center, the leaders of the Chalmers Center are the authors of the book When Helping Hurts, as well as a number of other resources that are super helpful about thinking about my own poverty as someone that's more middle class than the people we're serving, right? How do I address my own poverty? And then how do I bring that to bear to make sure that I'm ministering well to the poor? So the Chalmers Center is like a economic think tank out of Covenant College, and they do just a lot. Their blog is helpful, man. I've rethought how I think about Thanksgiving and Christmas by reading their blog. I've thought deeply about how I minister to my family and all. The sooner I get to a place where I have that posture of poverty before Christ, the more I get to see his riches, right? And I think they really help meld that in my mind and develop that. So,
awesome. We'll include that. I'm sure it'll be super helpful. Well, listen, I do want to get to that question I said was, what do you leave on the table? And there's a couple of things to that. Like, I feel like this podcast is a place for people to go behind the scenes. So when we have pre-preach, there was quite a bit of discussion after this sermon. I'd say on two fronts. Like, one was there was so much good stuff, and not everything could make it, into the sermon. So let's talk about that a little bit, and then just talk about the things that just engaged the most, that we wrestled with the most.
So one of the first things what I cut from my message was explaining more of the afterlife. Jesus tells this story, and he brings up Abraham's side and Hades, where there's like fire and torment and agony and pain. And so what's he talking about there? Is this like hell as we think about hell? Is like Abraham's side heaven? And so what I would love to explain a little bit is Jesus' teaching on hell. So he's elaborating on what we see throughout the Old Testament, this description of a place called Sheol, which is a temporary place that everyone goes, both the wicked and the righteous, when we die. And we see in Scripture there's at least two sides to Sheol. One of them would be where the righteous go, Abraham's side or paradise. This is where there's like peace and rest. And that's where Lazarus goes in the story. And then we also see what Jesus calls Hades, which is another word the New Testament uses for Sheol, but this is where the wicked go. This is where there's torment. This is where there's fire. But this isn't heaven and hell as we typically think of them in their finality, when we're saying, hey, they went to hell, or we're going to go to heaven or hell. In the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, chapters 20 or 19 through 22 kind of talk about the end of the age. So where all of the righteous and the unrighteous dead will be raised from the place of Sheol, or the place of the dead. And then there's going to be two destinations. Everyone who was in Abraham's side, all the righteous, they're going to be welcomed into the new heavens and the new earth with Christ to reign there forever. And then all the wicked will be cast into the lake of fire that's prepared for the devil and his angels. So that's the kind of the finality of heaven and hell as we think of it. The story from Luke 16 is just a picture of the temporary place all the dead go before the final judgment. But one of the things he talks about in this passage is the chasm between the two. So if you are in Sheol, it doesn't mean like, well, now I've got a chance to get to heaven. Like, your eternity is set. You can't go from one side of Sheol to the other.
This is not purgatory. This is not some sort of in and out kind of thing. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so the way you live your life now, and based on what you do with Christ, I mean, one of the big emphases in the passage there was like, what do you do with Moses and the prophets, with the Old Testament? Do you believe that they're pointing to Jesus, and have you placed your faith in him? If you have not, then you're going to go to Hades. Eventually, you'll be cast into the lake of fire. You cannot go from one side to the other. If you did embrace Jesus, then you will be in Abraham's side, and then later spend eternity with him in the new heavens and the new earth.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the most powerful parts of your sermon because I've always, even as a child, when I first heard this story, it's like, really? When Jesus says, listen, if someone rose from the dead, it would, if they don't believe the prophets and someone rises from that, it's not going to change their mind. I think it would, but your powerful point was, it happens. It happens twice, in the New Testament where a man really named Lazarus, Jesus' friends, over in the Gospel of John. He gets raised from the dead, and the Pharisees don't believe it, and they oppose it. Jesus himself rises from the dead. They don't believe it, and they oppose it.
Well, then all throughout the Gospels, Jesus says all these miracles, and people are attracted to them. But when his sayings get hard, like, they just drift away. I think in John chapter 2, he says, like, he knows what's in people's hearts and that they're just going to kind of drift away. So people who are just looking for a miracle and they're not going to listen to the words of Jesus or what's revealed in Scripture, then they're not going to, the miracle itself isn't going to cause them to finally believe.
Yeah, Jesus is smarter about people than I am, that's for sure. Because I didn't believe it, but then we see it happen just like Jesus says. So I got a final question here just as we wrap this up. But where do you find the gospel in this story? Maybe we can go out on that.
Yeah, I'll talk about like the challenge, and maybe you guys can answer this. But one of my challenges in this message is that Jesus speaks pretty like harshly about like eternal condemnation or hell if we don't love people, and we see that in some of the other passages that I shared about. And I think our tendency can be at times to say, well, we're not saved based on like loving people or doing good works. We're saved on placing our faith in Jesus. But there's so many times Jesus tells these stories of like, if you neglect the poor, then you're going to hell, and in this passage, he kind of makes that indication. So, and he doesn't like try to clarify in this moment, well, actually, you just need to place faith in me. He's really hammering like the way you live your life is leading you to hell. So that can be confusing, though, because obedience doesn't save us. So how would you clarify that?
There's kind of two directions that plays out in my mind. There's the sense in which the activities we do can draw us away from knowing the one who saved us, right? Like our activity can, whatever we make an idol, something will sit on the throne of my heart. And if it's something that is in Christ, it can draw me away from Jesus. And I can find someday that I never did place my faith in him.
You could be a philanthropist.
That's right.
A world-renowned philanthropist and go to hell.
You can have a tremendous amount of influence for good in the world, really repelling the effects of sin in the world without ever embracing the one who ultimately removes that sin, right? And then the flip side happens often where your heart becomes hardened. If you're the kind of person that embraces Jesus, follows him, and yet there's this one weird section of your life where you have no compassion for the poor, I would question whether you understand both the effects of sin in the world. That's poverty ultimately is because sin has broken what God made good, right? Poverty exists because those relationships that were right are now broken. And if you aren't so compelled by wanting to see reconciliation, the sin pushed back in this life as well as the next, if you don't have that kind of compassion, then I would also wonder, like, did you really embrace the one who repels and pushes back and conquers sin and death, right?
Yeah, I think, it's very easy to see, okay, well, here's where Jesus shows a path to hell, right? And this way, it goes, oh, well, I better not do that. And if I don't do that, I'll be okay. But I think, I can't remember if you used the exact language in your sermon, but, clearly this is a sinful path to hell, but obedience doesn't take us to heaven because we can't be good enough. We're all sinners. But, so for me in this story, just that Jesus is the true rich man, that Jesus is the man who is truly rich, and he didn't spend it on himself. He gave everything, even his own life, for us, the poor and the impoverished. He did what the Pharisees should have done, with their wealth. But it's only because we have a Savior. It's only we are all poor. We are broken. We can't fix our brokenness. But he's the true rich man who spent his riches on us, the poor, to make us rich and part of his family. But all right. Well, anyway, thanks for bringing a great
I think that's just teaching. A good reminder of like, if God has really saved us and we recognize that we're all beggars before God and he's been gracious to us, it's going to lead to a life of love for people.
Yes.
And doing kind of that big emphasis I had in the message is inviting people in.
I love that challenge, inviting people in. Well, again, thanks both of you for being here. Just always a pleasure to see you both. Thanks so much for all the time you invest in the teaching. It was really a great challenge and encouragement to all of us. And guys, we got one more week. That was week 9, 10th, final week. Next week, be back for the last installment of Storyteller.